Good evening. As you'll have gathered from the event information, I'm Dr. Iona Hine from the University of Sheffield, and it's my privilege to talk to you today and reflect on what I've learned about the experiences of Heinrich Walter Cassirer, a German Jewish immigrant to the UK who arrived in England at the start of 1934. My own interest in Cassirer began with the reality of a postdoctoral job, a fixed-term contract, where I'm charged with publishing and republishing Cassirer's works and arranging the preservation of an associated archive. Today's talk is tangential to the core of my work, but in encountering Cassirer's writing, I wanted to understand how he came to spend 20 years writing detailed commentaries on the work of the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, when he sincerely had not wanted to. In search of answers, I travelled to Oxford earlier this year, while such ventures were still possible, to take a look at Cassirer's file in the archives of the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning. I was going to share my screen, but my colleagues have made that not possible. Guys? So Cassirer was one of thousands, there we are. Cassirer was one of thousands of at-risk academics who have been supported by an organisation that began life in 1933 as the Academic Assistance Committee. The committee sought to provide urgent support and funding for scholars who had been forced out of German universities. The screen that you can now see is a projection of a temporary web page that I've set up because it seemed important to me that I, in telling someone else's story, provide others with access to the information that I've used to put this story together. History, working with history, is an act of interpreting, and I wanted to share that interpreting with you. So if you're interested to, whether today or in the next couple of weeks, you can go, all you need to put into your computer is this web address here, and it will load you a page that looks just like the one in front of me. Also, in terms of knowing where this information comes from, if you were to scroll down on this page, you've actually got my sources and also the things that I'm telling you I haven't consulted, whether that's because of time or equally because at the moment it's simply not possible to go and visit archives. Going back then to the Academic Assistance Committee. They were founded in 1933. The committee sought to provide support and funding urgently for scholars who had been forced out of German universities. It reshaped over time, but continued to keep track of those, like Cassirer, who it had heard were in need. Much of the information in the timeline tool that you see comes from their records now archived at the University of Oxford. I've created this temporary access to the data I collected so that you can explore the documents and testimony. The interpretation I've added to that timeline is limited, and what I say in the next 20 minutes or so is a first attempt to draw some conclusions. One of the earliest things I learned about the Academic Assistance Committee was that the University of Sheffield had declined to get involved. As a sponsor of this Migration Matters Festival, the university today recognises that welcoming and supporting migrants is something it should do. That won't mean it does so with any degree of expertise or perfection, but it is better than the reply given in 1933. I quote from David Zimmerman's work, and with due warning that you're about to hear an anti-Semitic trope. The opinion has been strongly expressed, writes the Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield, that as there are many rich men of the Jewish religion whose individual incomes are higher than the whole income of the university, it would be appropriate that they be asked to support the teachers in the first instance. Now, as it happens, Britain's Jews of all classes were active in providing for the welfare of newcomers and had been for decades. The difficulty for academics is that to be one, to have access to resources for study, to continue to make your living through education, you really benefit from being part of an institution, of a university. So the AAC, the Academic Assistance Committee, set out in partnership with the professional committee of what is now the World Jewish Relief Fund to use academic networks to raise funds from individuals and institutions and identify entry points for the refugee scholars. What I found in the archives of the AAC and its successors was that Jews, whether through the National Professional Committee or via local Jewish organisations in Glasgow, where Kasira found his first British job opening, were by far the most generous source of support for Kasira. There are gaps in my knowledge, and I have to reconstruct from an incomplete set of sources. But when taking on Kasira, the university set limits in place, adjusting these with some reluctance, if at all. The reality is that by age 30, Kasira had experienced a series of setbacks. In recollections published in the 1990s, Beatrix Walsh, a friend of the Kasiras from 1930s Oxford, mistakenly characterises the Kasira on his arrival in England as a nobody who had not even completed his thesis. This was false. By the time he left Germany, he had already published his first full-length book, discussing what the Greek thinker Aristotle had to say about the soul. In May 1933, 7 months before Kasira arrived in England, and while he was preparing to take a lecturer's qualification at the University of Zurich, Switzerland, the Oxford professor David Ross had given this book a hearty welcome. Kasira's chance at Zurich depended on the recognition his book could receive there. It was on the strength of this work, which he had begun life as his PhD thesis, defended successfully at the University of Heidelberg years before, that Ernst Howald, another classical philologist, welcomed Kasira as a kind of apprentice. Things went well until Switzerland, itself unsettled by an influx of German professionals who had lost jobs in Germany because of Hitler's anti-Aryan laws, decreed that no foreigners would be allowed to pursue an academic career there, that is, to take their habilitation, as Kasira needed. It was for this reason that the young Kasira and family made their way to Oxford at the turn of the new year in 1934. His sister had already relocated to London, and his father, the great Kant scholar, who had reared him in a Kantian atmosphere, had a one-year fellowship position at Oxford's All Souls College. But Kasira Jr. was welcomed in Oxford quite concretely, proposed for an honorary membership of the local Language Lovers Society that January by the same David Ross who had written the glowing review of his Aristotle book. It seems highly likely he was also at dinner with his parents, David Ross, and Richard Wynne Livingstone, who would reappear in Kasira's story in 1938, as Kasira transferred from Glasgow to the Oxford College of which Livingstone was then head, Corpus Christi. People sought an academic position for him because they knew his work, his potential. The appointment at Glasgow came via a somewhat circuitous route. 3 days after the dinner party, his father Ernst is found writing to the Academic Assistance Committee to ask them to send 4 scholars' files to Professor Peyton in Glasgow. None of these 4 names is young Hines. And yet scrutinising this list is enough to determine that these were proposals for the role of research assistant to support Peyton in preparation of his 2-volume commentary on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. My point is that in addition to being German speakers and vulnerable academics, these 4 men were being commended as Kant scholars. The exact sequence of events is unclear, but by the 16th of March, Peyton was writing to the Academic Assistance Committee to tell them that Kasira Jr. had been elected as a research fellow. Records show that Klibanski had turned the job down 2 weeks earlier, though he would keep the contact with Peyton. It is only from a series of interviews with Klibanski recorded in the 1990s that I have been able to establish that from his perspective, he had commended the young Kasira for the task. In partial corroboration, This letter from the AAC to another man in the Kubanski-Kosira network, Fritz Saxel, to tell him about the appointment, shows us the group of actors labouring in Kosira's support. And so Kosira arrived in Glasgow. Knowing a little bit about how he came to Glasgow, and that he came to Glasgow to support Peyton's work on Kant, is not a wholly satisfactory answer to knowing why he, as much a classicist and linguist by training, spent 2 decades working on a particular branch of philosophy against his own personal inclination. But the average early career academic can bring their own insight to that. The sense of obligation that comes from getting the job. The awareness of future prospects reliant on present success and a reference. The fact that the Kant project was tied into getting him a higher level academic qualification. The Glasgow University records, which I can't show you because it's a copyright image, show us that you can look yourself later. These attest his registration for the degree of D. Lit, Doctor of Letters. In fact, Glasgow finally awarded him the more basic PhD. Nonetheless, these small items, creating obligation, creating pressure, promising potential reward, help to explain how he would have begun on a path that he wasn't exactly sure about. And those stresses can only have been magnified, as far as I can see, by the presence of 2 dependents and the increasing hostility of the Germany he had left behind not a moment too soon. In the shadows is the fact that many encountered him as his father's son, making presuppositions about what kind of scholar he should be and what he ought to do. Now, this is a short talk. If you want to explore the timeline independently, you'll find more detailed correspondence, context, and recollections. But I will highlight 3 further moments in my tracing of Kosira's journey from his birth in Sternberg to a point of academic and economic security. In 1939, building on progressive and more overtly aggressive measures, the Hitler regime, to borrow Kosira's terminology, decided that it was not enough to retire Jewish professionals, as they had in 1933, to impose a thorough set of discriminatory laws, as had followed in 1935, and forbid Jews entering universities, as they had in 1937. They required universities to revoke every degree that had ever been awarded to a Jewish scholar. While I do not know whether Kosira received direct notification, the University of Heidelberg, which had awarded his PhD, certainly took steps to inform other such graduates that they were no longer entitled to refer to themselves as doctor. On the basis of that dark example, it seems doubly important to recognise that Kosira was by no means unqualified when he arrived in England. In 1940, Kosira was interned along with other scholars of German or Austrian nationality. The uppermost echelon of the University of Oxford was complicit in this action, and Kosira was not afraid to speak out against it. Beatrix Walsh, the same friend who erred in her account of Kosira's academic progression, shared some lighter tales from this period. Of a man who tried not to take his detention too seriously for the sake of those around him. The trail of letters surrounding this period suggests something darker. After the war passed, Kosira became a British citizen, something he'd been aiming at in the late 30s, but that war had made impossible. He then acquired a permanent contract at the University of Glasgow, which was by that point in the hands of a former Oxford philosopher, William Gould McLagan. McLagan knew his work on Kant and gave Kosira space to complete the second commentary. As I looked at the sidelines, the people acknowledged, I found continued evidence of friendships forged. I'm not sure that Peyton was ever a friend as such, but he wrote dozens of letters to secure further funding for Kosira, creating a role for him at Oxford through the war, and telling those who mattered that this man was worthy of attention. Again and again, as I've sought to drill down and ask who, how, why, I found human intervention. And somewhere behind that was expectation, for better or worse. I welcome your questions. And I hope you've had the information that questions have to come through the chat system. So someone has asked me whether expectation like this still drives most research in modern universities. It's an interesting question. One of the things that Kasura was interested in some ways one can almost trace this throughout his career, despite the fact that he moves between classics, philosophy, and in later life, biblical studies. One of the things that carries through is an interest in freedom and the extent to which choices we make are or aren't free. Ultimately, he left academia earlier than he needed to. He took early retirement and worked as an independent scholar because he felt that expectation. I mean, I'm interpreting how he felt, but that seems to be the case. There's a phase ahead of me in this project to look at his later works. And so I think, yes, just as Kasura experienced, there is a strong force of expectation upon people. That's partly about how universities are funded, that government funding comes through targets and through seeking particular goals. And I would be dishonest if I didn't say that, you know, reading about Kasura and his experience of precarity didn't ring bells from experience that I know early career academics have today. It's equally in Germany. So I skimmed over a little bit the situation around habilitation. That actually arrived as a process in 19th century Germany, that the idea was that a doctorate wasn't enough to guarantee that you were going to be good enough to teach in the university. So a new tier of qualification was introduced. So I think at the same time that there's nothing new about increasing pressures on academics, equally, yes, it's still present. You know, very similar pressures and expectations are around today, and it's in the nature of things like fixed term contracts that you need to meet a particular you are serving a particular need, and equally in teaching, you're serving, I mean, so Kasura achieved that thing of the permanent contract, and that's quite an important place, but it's not to say that it just changes the nature of the expectations around that. So one of the things that I discovered in probing around at Kathira's work is the extent to which, in fact, in the last decade, people have been writing about this period of history, about the kind of circles in which Kathira was a small part. That's one of the reasons that quote from Beatrix Welsh is so important to quash, because it comes up and, Kathira gets used as this example of someone who is a nobody. And he wasn't a nobody, he was at a vulnerable stage in his career. And the fact that he will have been preparing for habilitation in Germany, then he moves to Zurich to try to achieve the same thing. Then within months, he has to leave there and he goes to Glasgow, where he is promised a higher level of qualification, which he then doesn't get. The sheer frustration that must have been building in him from that, is keeping him down at a lower level. But he was by no means a nobody. But I think it was interesting to think about that. So I'm just going to share my screen again briefly, if I can. So this is just the further reading list. So and this is nested within the project website, so it's also possible to read some bits of his works later in the coming up relatively soon. We'll have a full recording of a play that he translated, which again actually treats these issues around freedom and migration. It's a story around the last day really of Oedipus, who has been exiled for crimes that he feels are not his fault. So yeah, that was a long-standing thing. But yes, I was just wanting to say that there's a lot of literature here that is relatively recent, and it's interesting to reflect on what it says about current academia, that we are looking back to learn about these social networks, what they achieved, how scholars, including Kathira, influenced the academic life in the countries where they moved on to. I have deliberately skimmed over some of the more unpleasant context with this talk, though you will find, if you explore the timeline for yourselves, that there are these pieces of context that are necessary to understanding the decisions, or to my interpretation of the decisions that Kathira makes, including to leave Germany in 1933. His father is also somebody who is prioritised as needing help, and who arrives in Oxford only to discover that people don't know who he is, which is a rather cruel thing. He had actually been to London several years previously and had a rather warmer reception, but he arrives at All Souls College in Oxford to discover that actually he's told something like, well, Oxford is a great springboard, and you're like, this man is almost 60, he's approaching, if he chose it, retirement. And you're telling him it's a springboard. So it wasn't an easy experience, even for more established scholars. So one question that's coming through is clearly from somebody who has a wider sense of Kathira. So I'm not particularly covered in this timeline because I was, because my own time was constrained and I wanted to kind of document his early life. But so by 1954, when he is writing, gets to the point of publishing his second commentary on Kant, he's actually made a rather large decision, or soon after, which is to be baptized as an Anglican. He reads the letters of St. Paul in Greek, because as a classical scholar, he has the skills to do that. He, throughout his works, is really interested in fidelity to working out what the author actually wanted to say. And that's true of his involvement with Paul and with Kant. So the question I've got is, how significant is Cassira's transition to Anglicanism in relation to his work on Kant? It's certainly, so it's where he's going to move on to next. I think I would need a lot more time to think about that question. I feel a lot like that's the next phase of where this project needs to go, is to explore his engagement, because there is a text that it was published in 1988, almost a decade after Cassira's death, in which he compares Kant's ideas about freedom and about morality with St. Paul. And that's quite, again and again, Cassira says, you know, of the philosophers, I think Kant is the top one. So it's, you know, I think Kant has a lot, you know, he's effectively saying he thinks Kant has a lot right. Kant has a sense of the darkness of, you know, potentially human nature. So for all that he thinks that ought means can, so that it's possible to do the right thing, it's also potentially very hard to. He is undoubtedly being, you know, partially telling a joke at the point that he says that everyone is familiar with the idea, you know, allegedly Kantian, that the morality of it, that it's essential to morality for an action that it should be contrary to what you actually want to do, contrary to the immediate inclination of the agent. And then he says, yes, like my work on Kant. But yeah, he really finds interesting the interplay between Paul and Kant. Got a comment that's come in, which is about knowing the big names of people who've succeeded in their fields. And so the question seems to be about other people who have to accept a change of academic direction. I think that it's not terribly uncommon and is the mark of a skilled scholar to be able to reorient. In terms of the people that I've come across, so part of the networks of which Cassira is to some small extent a part, which are the networks around the Warburg Institute, as it was in Hamburg, where which is a fantastic and very unusual library that was a resource for the scholars in Hamburg, and then came almost as its own refugee to Britain in late 1933, early 1934. So the people in that circle were very interdisciplinary. The library itself was arranged to facilitate people making connections that might not happen if you went to the shelves of a regular library. And that means that when Cassira talks about his father, it's as this sort of great Kantian figure. But Cassira, the book that was published, a collection of essays to celebrate Cassira Senior's career, it's called Philosophy and History. And that interaction of philosophy and history meant that as Cassira's work, it goes across a breadth, and it's not terribly surprising at some level that his sons should do the same. It's equally so. There is when you're going through and finding sources in the way that this research involves, you sometimes find small contradictions. So when Cassira's mother, Toni Cassira, writes in her memoirs, and she's writing these in the late 1940s, she actually talks about Cassira, Hines Cassira, the younger one. She talks about her son wanting to study philosophy at university, and the father saying, well, if you're going to do that, you need a grounding in something, almost like a more proper subject first. So, so he goes, according to her account, that's why he says, well, I'm good at languages, and he goes to study classics and classical languages. So it's, from that perspective, entertaining that in his later life, by 1954, he is saying, actually, I went to that, I did that to escape from Kant and from philosophy. So I guess that's testimony to the fact that there are always tensions in ourselves, but there's a level at which he was always open to some kind of movement. But looking back 20 years in and having struggled through the war period for this was a very hard time to be somebody who was astute and aware of what was happening in Germany, and had been for a decade previously. He'd really, the signs are he really struggled to get these commentaries written, though they remain in print and are important contributions to Kant studies. It was a difficult thing to spend 20 years with Kant, but he was open to being this kind of scholar who ranges between things, I think. So it looks to me like we have taken up our half hour. Thank you for taking part. Thank you for the questions. And I do encourage you, if you're at all interested in this, then do go to the website. And to get at the timeline at the moment, because it's a work in progress, you will need to go via that little link, which is tiny.cc/Coursera. I hope that's the right address. I will just double check that before I close down. Yep, tiny.cc/Coursera, and you can explore that timeline for yourselves. Thank you. I'll be grateful for feedback. Good evening.
Thank you very much for joining us for this Migration Matters Festival online event. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to make a donation, please visit migrationmattersfestival.co.uk/donate. Your donation will make a difference. Thank you.